For decades, he mocked scholars and bragged of brilliance. But Jasmine Crockett drops the SAT score Trump fought to hide 900. In seconds, the empire of ego begins to crumble. Cameras zoom in the crowd, gasps, and millions watch the mask of genius slip away. Can a leader survive when intellect turns into weakness? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The hearing room was a pressure cooker, cameras glaring like searchlights, every seat filled with reporters and lawmakers. The air buzzed with tension as if the entire country held its breath. This wasn't routine politics. It was a stage for a reckoning broadcast live to millions. One move, one sentence could set the nation on fire. Donald Trump sat at the witness table, arms folded, wearing that trademark smirk. He looked unshakable, radiating the bravado of a man who had called himself a very stable genius. For years, he mocked Harvard, sneered at professors, and ridiculed the educated as overrated. Now the very image he had built was about to face its deadliest test under the blinding lights. Opposite him sat Jasmine Crockett, calm but unyielding, the black folder before her like a loaded weapon. She knew once it opened, the mask of genius could shatter live, exposing arrogance as fraud. The silence after the opening was suffocating, the kind that seemed to press against the chest of every person in the room. Then Jasmine leaned forward, her voice calm but cutting. For years, Mr. Trump has mocked Harvard, sneered at professors, and called educated Americans stupid and overrated. He held up his supposed genius as a weapon against anyone who studied, worked, and earned their place. The words fell like knives, deliberate, precise, each syllable magnified by the microphones feeding millions of television screens. Trump sat stiff, his smirk twitching under the glare. The audience sensed something was about to detonate. Jasmine reached for the black folder, the one sealed with red tape, and slid out a heavy cream envelope. The cameras locked on her hands, zooming in as she peeled it open, slowly, painfully, like a surgeon about to expose a wound. She pulled out a faded sheet of paper, the kind that smelled of dust and history, and held it high enough for the room to see. The lens tightened, cutting to a close-up of the header, Scholastic Aptitude Test, SAT, 1965. Then, like a blade across glass, the numbers came into focus. Total score 900 out of 1,600. The explosion was immediate. Gasps tore through the chamber. A journalist in the front row muttered, "Oh my God," loud enough that the boom mics caught it and sent it echoing across the broadcast. Phones lit up in unison, vibrating on wooden tables, buzzing in purses, reporters fumbling to tweet before their competitors. The sound was like a hive of wasps, disturbed, furious, and unstoppable. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her calmness was sharper than any shout. In 1965, she said evenly, the national average hovered between 980 and 990. A score of 900 wasn't just below the bar for Harvard or Yale, it was beneath the bar for being called a genius at all. The contrast was brutal. Years of ridicule, years of boasts collapsed under a single number that glared back from a yellowing sheet of paper. Trump's face hardened, his jaw, locking his voice a growl. Nonsense, fake paper. A total forgery. He slammed his hand on the table, but the blow rang hollow, more defensive than defiant. Cameras caught the beads of sweat forming at his hairline, the twitch in his fingers, as though even he felt the weight of the page staring him down. Jasmine turned slightly, eyes locked on him, tone still measured but lethal. A low score doesn't make anyone worthless, she said, each word deliberate. But you, Mr. Trump, you spent decades using grades, IQ, and records as clubs to beat others down. You called people stupid. You called them failures. And now when the very weapon you brandished is turned back toward you, you dismiss it as meaningless. The chamber went silent again, not because it was calm, but because everyone knew the knife had landed. For the first time, the myth cracked. Millions of Americans watching from their living rooms, bars, and offices saw the gap between the legend of the very stable genius and the fragile truth of a man who barely cleared the line. The aura of invincibility faltered, the smirk no longer armor, but a mask beginning to crumble. Reporters scribbled furiously, anchors prepared their breaking news scripts, and social media raged like a wildfire spreading through dry grass. The first climax had erupted, and there was no way to put the flames back. The uproar over the score was still echoing when Trump's attorneys moved in for the kill. One sprang up, his tie, swinging, voice raised. Mr. Chairman, this hearing must be suspended immediately. This document is unverified, its origins are questionable, and its disclosure violates privacy protections. Another lawyer piled on, until the chain of custody is proven, this so-called evidence has no place in the record. The chamber erupted in overlapping shouts, cameras swiveling to capture the clash. For a moment it seemed the defense might succeed in halting the spectacle, wrapping the wound before it bled further. But Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. She leaned into the microphone, her tone level, her eyes steady. Call witness 1, Ms. Marjorie Lane. The order dropped like a gavel. An attendant opened the side door, and into the room stepped a woman in her late 70s, hair-silver posture, rigid with a lifetime of clerical discipline. She raised her right hand, swore the oath, and lowered herself into the witness chair. The murmurs subsided. Even Trump's lawyers hesitated, sensing danger. Jasmine began gently. Please state your name and role. The answer was crisp. Marjorie Ann Lane. Archives clerk 1975 through 1990. I handled sealed records, retention policies, and requests from legal counsel. Jasmine nodded once, then pressed. Ms. Lane, did you in or around 1984 receive a phone call from someone identifying himself as a legal advisor? Lane took a breath. Yes. The man said certain academic records must remain closed. He told me, quote, seal it, no public access, no exceptions. The chamber leaned forward. Jasmine's next question cut sharper, and the file he specified, Lane's answer, rang across the microphones. C-17. He repeated it twice. Gasps rustled through the audience. The identifier matched the internal code for Donald Trump's file. Trump shifted in his seat, jaw-tight, hands clasped too hard on the table. His attorney whispered furiously, but the cameras caught his unease. Jasmine gestured toward the document camera. Did you record that instruction? Lane nodded and produced a sheet of brittle paper edges, yellowed by age. Under the lens, the handwriting glared in thick graphite strokes. No leaks. Called CFO. Jasmine pointed. Is this your hand? Lane answered firmly. Yes, those were my notes. No leaks captured his order. Called CFO meant I informed our chief financial officer because money was mentioned as a follow-up. A wave of murmurs spread. The implication was unmistakable financial leverage to bury academic truth. Trump slammed his palm down. Ridiculous, totally fabricated, but the evidence stood mute and undeniable. Jasmine didn't rise to his outburst. Instead, she continued. Was your handwriting authenticated? Lane replied. Yes. Independent examiners compared samples from 1980, 1983, and 1989. All matched. The blow landed with surgical precision. Then the operator changed the feed. A timeline filled the main screen, stark against the chamber's marble walls. 1965 SAT examination. 1984 sealing request referencing C-17. 1990, 2015, repeated public statements mocking Harvard IQ and academic credentials. 3 points, 3 decades, one continuous thread. The audience watched as if the story wrote itself across time. Jasmine let silence hang before she spoke. This is not a stray embarrassment. This is a sequence, a score taken, a file sealed, a narrative weaponized. The words rolled steady, not shouted, but heavy as stone. Lawmakers exchanged glances and began to nod. It was no longer about a single test score. It was about a pattern of concealment and hypocrisy. In the gallery, reporters typed furiously. On live broadcasts, commentators whispered, "This doesn't look accidental. This looks orchestrated." Across the country, phones buzzed with 2 characters C-17. Viewers understood instinctively this wasn't coincidence, it was cover-up. Trump's lawyers muttered objections, but they sounded thin, even desperate. The pencil scrawl was too plain, the dates too clean, the line too straight. What had begun as one embarrassing number was now expanding into a map of deliberate action. The myth of the very stable genius no longer looked unshakable. It looked engineered, protected, shielded by secrecy. Jasmine closed her binder slowly, a subtle gesture that said the point was made. The timeline still glowed on the screen behind her, daring anyone to dismiss it. The chamber felt colder, now heavier, as if the truth itself had shifted the air. Lawmakers kept nodding, the audience sat hushed, and the public watching at home felt it too. This was not coincidence. This was intentional concealment, and everyone knew the ground was about to give way beneath Donald Trump. The silence from the timeline still lingered when Jasmine reached back into her folder. She lifted a single sheet fragile with age, its corners bent and stained. The room leaned forward as she slid it under the document camera. The feed zoomed in, revealing rough pencil lines scrawled across the page. The words were faint but legible. "Don't let the scores fall into the hands of the press." MC. The phrase hit the chamber like a thunderclap. Reporters gasped, lawmakers craned their necks, and whispers filled the air. Instantly, speculation erupted. "MC, that's Michael Cohen," someone hissed from the press bench. Another voice countered, "It could be anyone. Initials are just initials." The debate spilled across the room, every camera red light blinking to catch the frenzy. Trump's attorneys shouted objections, waving their hands. But Jasmine remained still, her face calm, her tone surgical. "I will not assign identity," she said. "What matters is not the letters. What matters is the pattern: power, money, silence." Her words cut through the noise. "We saw the score. We saw the sealing request. And now we see pressure applied to bury truth before it ever reached daylight." She paused, letting the chamber breathe under the weight of her statement. "The initials are less important than the method influence wielded: pressure, applied, silence bought." Trump shifted, muttering to his lawyers, but the cameras caught every twitch. The myth of invulnerability was cracking in real time. Then Jasmine pressed a button on the desk. The speakers crackled, filling the hall with a clipped male voice. Distorted just enough to mask identity, but clear enough to carry menace, the recording said, "This record must be protected. Absolute confidentiality for file C-17. In return, a contribution to the alumni fund will be arranged as a token of gratitude." The words rolled like poison through the room. Absolute confidentiality. File C-17. Contribution arranged. Each phrase hammered the point. The defense team bolted upright. Anonymous fabricated, one lawyer shouted, his voice breaking. But Jasmine held up her hand and cut him down with one line. Independent auditors verified the transfer records. At the exact same time this call was logged, the school's alumni account received a sizable deposit. The connection was undeniable. Not just a test score anymore, this was leverage money suppression. The audience reacted viscerally. A congressman dabbed sweat from his brow, his hands trembling with the napkin. Another whispered to a colleague, eyes wide, "This isn't about a low score anymore. This is systemic concealment." The phrase carried microphones picking it up, and within seconds, cable news chyrons blared, "Systemic cover-up." Reporters bent over their keyboards, typing furiously, their screens glowing like fireflies in the tense dark. In the press row, one journalist murmured, "This is the noose tightening," another replied. "From 900 points to a machinery of cover-ups, this is bigger than we thought." Their voices were low, but the words captured the shift in the entire nation's perception. This was no longer a story of embarrassment. It was a story of corruption of money used to shield a myth of institutions bending under pressure. Jasmine didn't gloat. She let the evidence stand alone. The letter with MC, the voice demanding absolute confidentiality, the money flowing into alumni coffers, all of it stitched together into a single picture. It was a noose around the myth of genius, drawn tighter with every exhibit. And as the chamber fell into stunned silence, the audience understood the story had moved beyond 900 points. It was now 900 plus the machinery of concealment, the currency of power, the purchase of silence. This wasn't a stumble. This was a system. The chamber had grown tense, heavy with whispers and the weight of earlier revelations. But Jasmine Crockett was not finished. She rose from her chair, her eyes steady, and spoke into the microphone with deliberate calm. "We now have testimony from inside the testing board itself," she announced. The room froze. For a moment, no one breathed. Even the cameras zoomed tighter, hunting for what was about to appear. Then the side door opened and an older man stepped forward, his hands trembling as he carried a thin folder. The man introduced himself. "My name is Richard Hale. I was a coordinator at the College Board in the 1980s. I supervised record security protocols and communication with external parties." His voice was quiet, but each syllable carried across the chamber. He sat down, placed his folder on the desk, and slid out a single memo, yellowed by time, the handwriting faded but still legible. Jasmine leaned forward and asked Mr. Hale, "Tell us what happened." Hale inhaled sharply and spoke. "In 1984, I received a call. The man identified himself directly as Donald J. Trump. The words cut like glass through the air. The chamber erupted in gasps. Reporters snapped their heads-up thumbs, racing across their phones. Hale continued. His voice was sharp, threatening. He said, and I wrote it down word for word, "If this ever leaks, you'll lose your jobs. If you keep it silent, you'll never run out of money." He tapped the page under the camera, and the projection on the big screen showed the faded pencil lines. Next to them was a note in block letters. Threat plus, promise silence, conas cash. The room fell into chaos. Some lawmakers covered their mouths, others shook their heads in disbelief. Jasmine asked, "And this was your handwriting, Mr. Hale?" He nodded firmly. "Yes. Verified by handwriting analysts last week. I never forgot that call. It was the clearest intimidation I ever encountered. Fear and money tied together. We were supposed to be guardians of integrity, yet we were treated like pawns." His voice cracked but held steady. "We stayed silent because we were scared, and because money did flow afterward." That last sentence detonated like a bomb. Phones buzzed violently, journalists leaned toward one another muttering, "This isn't a cover-up, it's extortion and bribery." Trump exploded from his seat, red-faced, his voice shaking the microphones. "Lies, all lies. This man is a fraud. I never spoke to him. He's making it up." He slammed his palm down the echo, sharp across the marble chamber. But the camera cut to Hale, who sat composed, eyes glassy, with age and memory, holding the brittle paper steady. The contrast was devastating, Trump raging like a cornered animal, the witness still and unbroken. The audience at home didn't need persuasion. They could see where credibility lived. Jasmine did not raise her voice. She waited until Trump's outburst ebbed, then spoke with surgical precision. "Threats and bribes may silence a boardroom, Mr. Trump, but they cannot silence a nation watching tonight." She reached into her folder and pulled out a document, sliding it across the desk toward him. "If this testimony is false, if this memo is a fabrication, then sign this release. Unseal the full academic record tied to file C-17. Sign it now, right here, in front of the American people." The camera zoomed in, catching every flicker of Trump's expression. He picked up the pen, his fingers tightening around it, the ink tip hovering above the page. The entire chamber held its breath. The silence was unbearable, stretching second after second. The tension wound tighter and tighter. Finally, Trump exhaled, slammed the pen down, and shoved the paper back. He shook his head violently. His attorney leaned in, whispered in his ear, but Trump only waved him off, muttering under his breath. The refusal was loud even in silence. Control rooms across the networks hit their buttons at the same time. On every screen in America, a bold red chyron appeared, "Refuses to unseal." The chamber erupted. Lawmakers whispered fiercely. Reporters shouted over one another. Cameras flashed like lightning. The country watching from living rooms, offices, and bars understood instantly what this meant. You don't refuse if there's nothing to hide. You don't reject transparency unless the truth is more dangerous than the accusation. In that moment, the story of Donald Trump's SAT score was no longer about numbers on a page. It was about threats made behind closed doors, promises of money for silence, and the raw fear that once kept an institution quiet. Jasmine Crockett had not just revealed a low score, she had revealed the machinery of intimidation that kept it hidden. And as the broadcast burned the words, "Refuses to unseal" into millions of screens, America saw the mask of the stable genius fall apart, replaced by something far uglier: fear, lies, and silence bought at a price. The roar of disbelief from Trump's refusal still lingered when Jasmine made her next move. She leaned down, pulled the original SAT record back into view, and placed it under the document camera once again. The room quieted, a wave of curiosity replacing the earlier chaos. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her fingers sliding down the faded form, "I'd like to draw your attention to something most people overlook. Not the score, not the student name, but this." The red dot from the projector circled a small code printed at the bottom corner: Proctor ID WJ74. The camera zoomed tight, filling the big screen with the stark black letters. Jasmine let the silence hold for a moment before speaking again. "WJ74, she repeated. This code matches the initials and staff number of the proctor on duty that day, William J. Carter. A ripple ran through the audience. Lawmakers shuffled their papers, reporters bent over their laptops, fingers flying across keys. Few in the public knew the name, but within the chamber, people began exchanging glances. Jasmine pressed forward. Who was William J. Carter? That's the question. She let the staff slide another document into the projector feed. A second page appeared stamped with an old College Board disciplinary notice. It was dated 2 years after Trump's test 1967, and the text was chillingly clear. Proctor William J. Carter suspended for failure to enforce testing protocols, accused of permitting unauthorized breaks, overlooking communication between test takers, and failing to report irregularities. A low gasp swept the chamber. The dots were beginning to connect themselves. Jasmine did not accuse directly. She didn't need to. She looked across the room, her voice even sharp. Donald Trump scored below average. That is now public record. But here is the question the American people deserve to ask. Was that score the result of a fair exam, or one watched by a proctor already known for bending rules? The words echoed, hanging in the air. Trump shifted uneasily, his hand clenched tight around the microphone base. The camera caught the sweat glistening on his forehead. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Reporters whispered fiercely to each other, the phrase "guilty proctor" rippling down the press rows like wildfire. Lawmakers leaned back in their chairs, some shaking their heads, others scribbling furiously. Outside the chamber, news bulletins flashed across screens, and millions of viewers at home typed the name into their searches, watching in disbelief as old records and clippings appeared online within seconds. The narrative was no longer about one man's low score. It was about whether he had even played by the rules. Trump tried to interject, voice ragged angry. "This is slander. This is guilt by association," he barked, slamming his palm down again. "I took that test like everyone else. No favors, no cheating. But the room was not buying it." Every camera stayed on the proctor ID projected 20 feet wide behind him, paired with the damning suspension record. His denial sounded hollow against the hard ink of official documents. His rage, once a weapon, was now a shield cracking under pressure. Jasmine remained poised, eyes locked on him. She didn't raise her tone, but her words cut deeper than any shout. "No one here said you cheated, Mr. Trump. But when every road leads back to shadows, sealed files, anonymous contributions, and now a compromised proctor, the American people must wonder, why do all the pieces fall into the same gray zone?" She paused, letting the silence grow thick. If everything was above board, if there was nothing to hide, why do the records keep circling back to suspicion? The effect was devastating. What began as laughter over a low score had transformed into a storm of moral outrage. Americans could forgive mediocrity. They could not forgive corruption. A below-average SAT was embarrassing, but the possibility of favoritism, of a rigged exam overseen by a man later punished for looking the other way, that was something else entirely. It was not a punchline anymore. It was a betrayal. In living rooms across the nation, fathers and mothers told their kids, "This is why fairness matters." The chamber itself seemed to feel the shift. Where earlier the scandal was treated with smirks and whispers, now the weight of betrayal hung heavy. This was no longer about a test. It was about the principle that every student, rich or poor, should face the same rules, the same silence, the same clock ticking down. To tamper with that was to tamper with the very idea of merit. Jasmine had turned a joke into an indictment of fairness itself. And in that moment, America's outrage solidified. What began as mockery of a stable genius now burned as anger at the possibility of fraud. The chamber was still humming from the revelation about the proctor when Trump's lead attorney rose to his feet. He buttoned his jacket, steadied his voice, and tried to seize control of the narrative. "Scores do not define intelligence," he declared, his words echoing off the marble. "My client has built towers, companies, and a presidency. He has succeeded far beyond the reach of a single number written decades ago." He spread his hands as though laying down the final word. For a moment it seemed like he had found a way to turn the tide. But Jasmine Crockett was ready. She did not pull out another file or wave another sheet of evidence. Instead, she reached beneath the desk and lifted a single photograph. She held it high enough for the cameras to lock in. It showed a tired man in a work shirt sitting at a kitchen table under the dim glow of a single bulb. Next to him sat his young daughter, her notebook open, a pencil in her hand. The caption, written in Jasmine's own hand, read, "A father teaching his child math at midnight." Jasmine's voice was calm, almost gentle, but the words carried like a drumbeat. "I agree," she said. "Scores do not define intelligence." She let the image linger on the giant screens above them. The silence was deafening as everyone absorbed it. Then her tone hardened, each syllable sharp as glass. "But Mr. Trump, you used scores as a weapon. You mocked Americans who studied, who worked, who sacrificed. You turned numbers into a whip, striking down anyone who didn't serve your ego. And now when that same whip circles back to you, you call it meaningless." The lawyer shifted uneasily, but Jasmine pressed on. Her finger tapped the photo, punctuating every word. "This man," she said, "is not defined by a number. He is defined by discipline, by love, by honesty. He does not hide from a test. He teaches his child how to face one." The gallery erupted in murmurs, the power of the image hitting harder than any stack of documents. Trump fidgeted, tugging at his tie, his eyes darting toward the photograph as though it were an accusation in itself. Then came Jasmine's killing line, delivered with perfect clarity. "No one has ever been condemned for a low score. But liars," she said, her voice rising, "are condemned by their own words." The phrase landed like a gavel strike. The crowd broke. Applause thundered through the chamber, rolling like storm clouds across the ceiling. Reporters shot to their feet, their cameras flashing. The chair pounded his gavel in vain, shouting for order, but the ovation would not stop. It was the sound of truth-piercing pretense of a mask being ripped away on live television. Trump sat frozen. The papers in front of him, once his shield, now lay scattered like debris. The release form sat in the center, untouched, the pen beside it unused. For a long moment he stared at it, his head bowed low, the cameras capturing every second. His lawyer leaned toward him, whispering frantically, but Trump did not respond. The anger was gone, replaced by something heavier, the weight of exposure. The audience saw it. The country saw it. Jasmine didn't need to say another word. The photograph still glowed on the screen, a portrait of dignity that dwarfed the bluster at the witness table. She lowered it slowly, returning it to the folder, and sat back with the quiet confidence of someone who knew the battle had already been won. The chamber, still roaring with applause, seemed to recognize the same. This was no longer about a number on a decades-old test. The debate had shifted. It was now about character, about honesty, about what it means to face the truth. The score, 900 out of 1600, was almost secondary. What mattered was the man's refusal to live by the standards he forced upon others. What mattered was the hypocrisy revealed in front of millions. Jasmine had flipped the script. What had started as a fight over arithmetic had become a trial of moral arithmetic, and Donald Trump was failing the only test that mattered. The applause from the chamber was still fading when the outside world answered back with a roar. The morning news led with a single banner that swallowed the screen, 900 Gate. By noon, rival networks countered with a colder frame, double standard. Editors repeated the labels like drum beats, the words pulsing at the bottom of every broadcast. It felt less like coverage and more like a national alert, a siren blaring through every living room. On cable panels, anchors traded tight questions while guests tried to keep up with the surge. "How does 900 Gate reshape the race?" one asked, tapping a stack of notes that had grown an inch in an hour. A former campaign manager replied, "It's not math, it's trust. Double standard is the story." Late-night producers clipped the confrontation into a clean, brutal sequence for the monologues. The laughter landed, but the sting lingered. By afternoon, phones at finance committees wouldn't stop buzzing, and not in a good way. Donors who once confirmed tables with a single text now asked for time to review developments. A private email from a major backer read, "We support success, not secrecy," and the check never arrived. A dinner that had been oversold suddenly had a front row of empty plates. Event planners stared at floor plans that looked like maps of retreat. The pressure wasn't just money, it was the microphone. At every rope line, reporters leaned forward and fired the same question, first, last, and always, "Will you sign the release?" It followed him from hotel lobbies to airport tarmacs, from state fairs to gilded ballrooms. He tried to pivot to familiar themes, but the sentence cut through every detour. Will you sign the release became the tolling bell no one could ignore. Even surrogates couldn't outrun it. A press aide approached a gaggle with a binder of talking points and never opened it. Will he sign the release, reporters asked in a single voice as if trained by the same conductor. We have nothing to add, the aide tried, but the chorus only swelled. The briefing ended before it began, and cameras swung away in open disappointment. On stage, the old line sounded brittle. My IQ is very high, he declared at a rally, expecting applause. From the back of the crowd, a clean reply sliced forward 900 out of 1600. It wasn't a chant at first, more like a verdict thrown across the rafters. He pushed on, but the phrase kept returning, a thin blade that found its target again and again. Debate preppers saw it coming and still couldn't stop it. The moderator asked about merit, and he reached for familiar armor. I was smarter than the experts. A rival smiled without mirth and said 900 out of 1600. The hall cracked with gasps and scattered laughter, the kind that wounds more deeply than booze. In the spin room, no surrogate could sell a different headline. Television turned the boomerang into a loop. Every time he boasted on tape, genius top of the class, smartest in the room, the supercut snapped back with a lower third that read 900 out of 1600. Fact-checkers didn't need graphics. They just played the numbers and let them speak. Commentators stopped debating the figure and started debating the character behind it. The clip ran on a loop until the word genius sounded like a dare. Online, the transformation was immediate and merciless. The old title, Very Stable Genius, lost its grip in a single weekend. In its place, a new label spread through posts, captions, and text threads, Barely Past Trump. The phrase required no explanation. It carried its own evidence. People used it like a mirror, holding up the nickname to every claim of superiority until the image cracked. The cultural shift seeped into small corners of daily life. A morning radio host tried to play neutral and still slipped, saying barely past, "Sorry, Mr. Trump will hold a rally tonight." A sports commentator joked that a quarterback had a 900 out of 1600 decision on a busted play, and the booth fell silent before laughing too hard. Stand-up comics didn't even write new jokes. They just paused and said the number. The room did the rest. Behind the scenes, strategists rearranged the furniture and pretended the floor hadn't moved. New memos advised speakers to acknowledge education as multifaceted, a polite way of saying, "Don't touch IQ." Pollsters stopped asking about intellect and started asking about honesty. The answers were colder than last month, and the trend lines bent in the wrong direction. The campaign's words grew careful, even as the country's words grew blunt. At podiums where applause once lifted the room, the energy became cautious, then brittle. When he reached for the old swagger, "I know more than the generals, the economists, the scholars," the silence replied first. Then someone whispered 900 out of 1600, and the whisper was loud enough to be picked up by a mic. He pushed through the script, but the performance felt like glass underfoot. One wrong step and the shards would sing. Reporters learned to wait. He would talk about growth, borders, crime, anything but the paper on the table. Then a hand would rise and a voice would cut clean. "Will you sign the release?" It didn't need flourish, only repetition. The question sat there like a locked door everyone could see. He never found the key. Opinion pages grouped the moment under two headlines and dared readers to choose 900 gate for the shock, double standard for the why. One columnist wrote, "A low score is human. Building a brand on genius while hiding the score is something else." Another said, "This isn't about tests, it's about truth." Both pieces went viral because they agreed on the center. The story had moved from numbers to trust. And that was the real damage, the kind that doesn't light up in a single poll, but spreads like a stain. Donors stepping back weren't just counting dollars, they were counting risks. Voters who once waved away, bragging as showmanship, now heard it as confession. The name Barely Past Trump didn't just mock, it measured the distance between claim and reality. The erosion was steady in public. Each day brought the same two hammer strikes, 900 out of 1600, and will you sign the release? Events grew shorter statements, tighter smiles, thinner. The brand that once floated on swagger now dragged an anchor named doubt. No one needed to shout. The silence after the question did the shouting for them. By the end of the week, the labels had stuck like paint. 900 gate colored every story, double standard explained every reaction. The nickname owned the timelines and the talk shows, and the question owned every microphone. Wherever he went, it went to a spotlight he could not dim. The numbers had stopped arguing, the character was on trial now. What began as a headline had hardened into a frame that would not budge. 900 out of 1,600 barely passed Trump. Will you sign the release? Each phrase was simple, repeatable, impossible to outrun, and as they echoed across the country, his political stature and moral authority thinned in equal measure, not with a crash, but with a relentless scrape. The headlines had already scorched the nation, but what followed was even more remarkable. At first, the scandal was entertainment memes of 900 out of 1,600 splashed across social media comedy skits, replaying the moment Jasmine held up the test card. But within days, the tone shifted. What started as a laugh became a conversation. Roundtables sprouted on television, not about the number itself, but about what it symbolized. Professors of philosophy and psychology sat beside former teachers and civic leaders, and the questions grew deeper. What defines intelligence? Is humility more important than raw talent? Can a leader claim greatness while mocking the very idea of learning? The shift was jarring, almost cinematic. A Friday night comedy monologue cut suddenly to a Sunday morning panel, where an ethicist said, "This is not about Mr. Trump's score. This is about the way we measure worth." A historian nodded, adding, "We've always wrestled with the myth of genius in America. We elevate the boastful and forget the builders, the teachers, the quiet problem solvers." Clips of Jasmine's words. "No one has ever been condemned for a low score, but liars are condemned by their own words circulated not just as sound bites, but as discussion prompts in classrooms." Across coffee shops, libraries, and living rooms, the scandal had mutated into something heavier, a debate about intellect, humility, and morality. Political circles could not ignore it either. In Congress, lawmakers from both parties faced the same swarm of questions in their districts. Parents asked why politicians obsessed over test scores while schools lacked funding. Veterans demanded to know why leaders mocked education while millions struggled with retraining. By midweek, a resolution hit the floor. Its title was blunt: to prohibit the use of academic test scores and claimed IQ levels as weapons in political campaigns. Though symbolic, the debate carried weight. Members argued live on C-SPAN that campaigns should be fought on policy, not on inflated boasts of genius. The hearings were electric. One congressman read aloud Jasmine's line, "When you measure others by standards you yourself never met, that's not confidence. It's fraud." The words rang across the chamber like a sermon. Even opponents found themselves cornered. To vote against the resolution was to defend the very hypocrisy now scorched into the public consciousness. Within weeks, the measure passed overwhelmingly. It was non-binding, but it sent a message. The weaponization of IQ had been outlawed in spirit, if not yet in statute. But the story didn't stop at Capitol Hill. Across the country, community centers sensed an opening. What if the scandal could be turned into opportunity? Flyers appeared. Adult math classes, no scores, just learning. Gyms and recreation halls that once hosted bingo nights now held evening classes for arithmetic and algebra. The surprising twist: the largest demographic to sign up wasn't teenagers or college dropouts. It was adults in their 50s and 60s. Men who had once worked factories now closed. Women who had left school to raise families. Retirees who had always carried the quiet shame of math anxiety. They filled classrooms, pencils in hand, laughing nervously as they solved fractions under fluorescent lights. Journalists flocked to cover it. A 62-year-old man in Ohio said, "I never thought I'd be back in a math class, but if leaders are going to mock scores, I want to prove to myself it's never too late to learn." In Texas, a grandmother explained, "My grandson asked me to help with homework. I didn't want to shrug anymore. I wanted to sit with him and try." The movement spread like a spark catching dry grass. Suddenly, education wasn't about humiliation, it was about community resilience and dignity. Inside families, the scandal redefined dinner table conversations. Parents who had once slammed report cards on the table, demanding explanations for every number, now tried a different question. "What did you learn?" One mother posted on Facebook, "For the first time, I told my son I didn't care if his grade was a B. I asked him what book made him curious." Stories poured in of fathers who had once barked, "Where are your grades now?" saying, "Show me what problem you solved today." The cultural pendulum had swung, nudged not by policy papers or campaigns, but by the image of Jasmine Crockett holding a test card and exposing the weaponization of learning. Through it all, Jasmine's image crystallized into something rare. She was not seen as a politician who humiliated a rival, though the moment was viral and brutal. Instead, she was cast as the woman who redirected the spotlight from arrogance to humility, from mockery to fairness. Commentators wrote that she had restored the dignity of education. Editorials called her a defender of fairness in the intellectual arena. Her voice, once just another in the House chamber, now carried moral authority. She was no longer just Jasmine Crockett, Congresswoman. She had become Jasmine Crockett, the conscience of a national debate. Trump's image, however, carried scars that would not heal. He did not collapse overnight. His base remained defiant, waving banners and chanting slogans. But something subtle and permanent had shifted. The weapon he had wielded for decades, the claim of intellectual superiority, was gone. Every time he reached for it, the crowd, the press, and even his rivals had a ready blade, 900 out of 1600. The label stuck not as laughter anymore, but as a reminder of hypocrisy. His words about IQ and genius now sounded hollow, stripped of edge. The loss was not a headline. It was a slow erosion, a draining of credibility that no speech could refill. In universities, professors began designing seminars titled The Myth of Genius in Politics. Students debated the Crockett confrontation as a case study. One slide featured side-by-side photos, Trump declaring himself the smartest in the room, and Jasmine saying, "Scores don't define intelligence, but hypocrisy does." The contrast was undeniable. Academic conferences, once reserved for obscure debates, now opened with panels on truth, power, and the dangers of weaponizing intellect. What had begun as scandal had become curriculum. The ripple effects touched culture in unexpected ways. Talk shows booked philosophers as guests. Bookstores reported spikes in sales of titles about humility, grit, and character. A new documentary crew followed adults re-entering classrooms, titling their project 900: The Re-Education of America. The scandal, instead of fading, expanded into art study and reform. Every sector seemed to seize a piece of the narrative, weaving it into something larger. And always Jasmine's line repeated like a heartbeat: "No one has ever been condemned for a low score, but liars are condemned by their own words." It was etched into editorials quoted in sermons, painted on protest signs. Churches spoke it from pulpits. Teachers wrote it on whiteboards, and parents told it to children at bedtime. It became more than a rebuke, it became a proverb. The country had found in her words not just a verdict on one man, but a guidepost for itself. Meanwhile, Trump could still fill arenas, but even there the shift was visible. When he said, "I'm a very stable genius," laughter rippled not with him, but at him. Supporters winced, aware that cameras were waiting for the clip. Rivals no longer scrambled for rebuttals. They just said 900 out of 1600 and the debate ended. The sword he once wielded had turned into a dagger pointing back at him. He had not lost all his power, but he had lost his sharpest weapon. The story in the end was never just about a score. It was about what America expects from those who lead. It was about whether pride can masquerade as wisdom, whether arrogance can sustain power. And it was about a woman who refused to fight on numbers alone, who chose instead to fight on truth. In that choice, Jasmine Crockett reshaped the battlefield. Trump was still standing, but he would never again stand as the self-proclaimed genius. He would stand as the man whose test score unmasked his own double standard. The classroom faded behind Jasmine, but its echo followed her into the night. The sight of adults hunched over notebooks, relearning equations with dignity, stayed in her mind like a flame that refused to dim. She knew the scandal would dominate headlines for weeks. She knew pundits would wring it dry. Yet the truest weight of it all was not a number on a test card. It was what that number revealed about power, pride, and the choices people make when given the chance to lift others or strike them down. That was the lesson America could not afford to miss. The human lesson was simple yet sharp as a knife: intelligence is not a weapon. It is not a trophy for the privileged or a mask for the arrogant. It is a tool for growth, for service, for opening doors where walls once stood. Jasmine's words in the chamber: "No one has ever been condemned for a low score, but liars are condemned by their own words," had become more than a rebuke. They had become a mirror. The scandal forced America to look into that mirror and ask whether it valued honesty more than swagger, fairness more than bravado. Everywhere she went, people repeated the question. In a grocery store, a cashier whispered, "My daughter's grades aren't perfect, but she's the hardest worker I know." In a diner, a truck driver told a reporter, "I never cared about tests, but I know what it means to be straight with people." On the radio, a teacher reminded listeners, "The measure of a man isn't a number, it's whether he tells the truth when the number doesn't flatter him." These voices were not polished, not strategic, but they carried the weight of lived experience. Together, they sounded like a chorus answering back to the arrogance of one man. The scandal had begun as spectacle, but the lesson cut deeper. For decades, Trump had wielded intellect as a sword, mocking rivals, dismissing scholars, turning IQ into a cudgel. Now that sword lay broken, exposed as theater. The truth was brutal, no one laughed at the score itself. They recoiled at the hypocrisy, the years of scorn hurled at others, while hiding his own shortcomings. The human lesson was that lies rot trust faster than any mistake. A low grade can be forgiven, contempt cannot. In living rooms, families felt the shift. Parents stopped asking, "What did you score?" and started asking, "What did you understand?" The difference was small but seismic. A boy who once feared showing his report card now brought home a science project with pride. A girl who had struggled with fractions showed her mother the steps she had written out, not just the answer. And instead of shame, there was encouragement. "You're learning," the parents said. That was the real victory, not the fall of a politician, but the rise of a new way of valuing knowledge. The human lesson rang especially loud in classrooms. Teachers printed Jasmine's quote and taped it above their chalkboards. "Liars are condemned by their own words," the posters read, reminding students that truth was not a punishment, but a shield. Students who once rolled their eyes at homework began to see the bigger picture. School was not a contest of genius. It was practice in honesty, resilience, and humility. Even the smallest classroom became a battlefield where arrogance could be defeated not by grades but by integrity. The moral stretched far beyond schools. In workplaces, supervisors stopped praising only the smartest in the room and began praising those who admitted when they needed help. In churches, pastors quoted Jasmine's words as modern scripture. "No one is judged for weakness," one preacher thundered, "but hypocrisy will find you out." In sports arenas, coaches told their players, "Don't mock others. Train harder. Win fair." What had begun as political theater was transforming into a cultural compass, a reminder of the values America wanted to claim again. And yet the lesson was not gentle. It cut with the same force as the scandal itself. It warned that power without humility curdles into cruelty. It showed that hiding flaws while mocking others is not strength, but weakness multiplied. America saw a man who could have admitted imperfection, who could have turned his low score into a story of resilience, and instead chose arrogance and deceit. The lesson was not abstract. It was a living example played out on live television of what happens when ego devours honesty. Jasmine never claimed the spotlight for herself. She repeated over and over that this was not about humiliating an opponent. It was about reminding the country that dignity is earned by truth, not by boasting. Her restraint made the lesson more powerful. She had all the ammunition in the world, but chose to fire only one kind of bullet, the truth. That decision elevated her above the fray and left Trump sinking under the weight of his own contradictions. The human lesson struck deepest because it belonged to everyone. It was not reserved for scholars, politicians, or pundits. It was felt by the janitor studying at night, by the nurse working double shifts, by the father teaching math at the kitchen table. They knew what it meant to face difficulty without turning it into a weapon. They knew the value of humility because life had taught them harder than any exam. And now they saw in real time what happens when a leader forgets that truth. On the airwaves, the debate expanded. Scholars argued about the definition of genius, but ordinary Americans argued about the definition of decency. Call-in shows lit up with voices from every corner of the country. "I don't care what my neighbor scored," one caller said. "I care if he's honest with me," another added. "My boss has a PhD but treats people like dirt. I'd rather work for the guy who admits he doesn't know everything." The conversation had shifted. Intelligence no longer stood on a pedestal. Humility had taken its place. The moral reached into politics itself. When lawmakers passed the resolution against using IQ as a political weapon, they admitted what everyone already knew: the scandal had changed the rules of the game. Candidates would still brag, still boast, still spar, but the public had seen what happens when pride outruns truth. The phrase 900 gate became shorthand for arrogance exposed. Politicians learned quickly mock others at your own risk, because the country was now tuned to hypocrisy like a watchdog to a whistle. The human lesson was also about fairness. For every student who had failed a test, for every worker who had stumbled, the scandal said your worth is not erased by a number. What erases worth is dishonesty. What erodes dignity is contempt. Fairness meant that everyone was held to the same standard, not of genius, but of truth. The lesson became a kind of national contract signed not in ink, but in conversation and reflection in the way people chose to treat each other after the storm. Jasmine embodied that contract. She never gloated. She never called herself a genius in return. She let the facts stand, then stepped back to let the country wrestle with what they meant. Her refusal to sink to arrogance turned her into something more than a victor. She became the voice of the lesson itself, a reminder that truth carries its own power, quiet but unstoppable. That was why her image looking through the window of a night class had burned into memory not as triumph but as testimony. The human lesson endured because it was not built on scandal alone. Scandals fade, memes die. But lessons, if they are true, settle into the ground and grow roots. This one grew into classrooms, workplaces, families, and churches. It whispered at dinner tables and thundered from pulpits. It reshaped the questions parents asked their children and the standards leaders were held to. It was no longer about a test in 1965. It was about America in the present deciding what kind of intelligence it wanted to honor. And so the scandal closed not with numbers, but with words that could not be erased. We do not study to become Einstein. We study so we do not use our fear as a whip against others. That line spoken in a night class summed up everything Jasmine had fought for. It was the final verdict of a trial that was never really about scores. It was about humanity, humility, in the refusal to weaponize learning. It was a reminder that the measure of greatness is not how high you rise, but how honest you remain when you fall. From that silent window, the lesson moved to the crowd. The scandal had been loud, but the meaning grew in a quieter register that carried farther. People replayed the footage and stopped the clip, not on the number, but on the moment the truth stood its ground. They began to talk less about a score and more about what a score can never prove. What mattered now was what endures when the lights cut out, when the cameras go home, when a person is left with only their word. That is where the audience found the message worth keeping. First, they said it plainly: scores do not define intelligence. A number measures a day, not a life. A test measures a slice, not a soul. Intelligence is not a trophy you lift over others. It is a tool you use to build with others. A mechanic with grease under his nails can outthink a spreadsheet if the engine is his language. A nurse on the night shift can solve a problem faster than a boardroom if the problem bleeds. Intelligence shows up where work gets done, not where boasting gets loud. Viewers felt that in their bones because they live it. A mother who never liked math taught herself fractions to help her daughter, and the look on the child's face said more than any percentile. A grandfather who forgot the formula still remembered how to stand steady for a scared teenager, and that steadiness was a kind of genius. A cashier who never took the SAT knows the price of kindness and charges it by example. The audience saw themselves in those scenes and understood no chart, no curve, no score can measure that. They didn't need a panel to tell them so. They had their own lives as proof. Second, the crowd found a new ruler: humility and honesty. Humility is not a whisper. It is the courage to say, "I do not know," and then to learn. Honesty is not a pose. It is the spine to say, "I was wrong," and then to correct. Together they are stronger than any brag because they can survive bad news and come back better. When Jasmine said, "No one has ever been condemned for a low score, but liars are condemned by their own words," the room heard a verdict and a vow. The audience took that line home and taped it to the refrigerator of their minds. They measured leaders by it and felt the difference. A leader who admits limits is safer than a leader who worships his own reflection. A leader who honors teachers is wiser than a leader who mocks study. A leader who stands still for the truth, even when it stings, is braver than a leader who runs from a page with his own name on it. Humility and honesty do not trend. They endure. The audience wanted less thunder and more ground that holds. Third, they agreed on what real intelligence is, for it is not for boasting, it is for light. Boasting is a mirror that blinds the boaster and bores the room. Light is a lantern that helps everyone see the next step. Real intelligence clears fog, not throats. It points the way for someone else, not just the way to a camera. It fixes, teaches, shares, steadies, and forgives. It turns "look at me" into "let me show you," and then into "now you try." People began to act on that without waiting for a rule. A coach stayed late and showed a kid how to break a press, not just bark to be smarter. A paramedic explained his checklist to a trainee, while sirens howled because light must be passed hand to hand. A foreman took a new hire aside and drew the safety plan on a cardboard box, not to look clever, but to keep a stranger alive. A pastor in a small town told his church, "If your knowledge humiliates, it is not wisdom." The crowd nodded because the line fit the lesson like a blade in its sheath. The audience also held on to a hard truth. Arrogance is loud because it is afraid. Pride swings numbers like a whip when it has nothing kinder to offer. Dishonesty piles words on words because the facts refuse to move. Real confidence does not need props. Real character does not need a stage. People can tell when courage is real because it risks something. People can tell when humility is real because it serves someone. Home by home, the message settled. Parents asked, "What did you learn today?" instead of "What did you score?" Children answered with steps, not headlines. "I showed my work. I fixed my mistake. I tried again." Kitchens became classrooms where patience replaced pressure. Living rooms became labs where curiosity could breathe. The mood shifted from judgment to effort, from fear to practice, from shame to growth. Workplaces felt it too. Managers stopped rewarding the loudest voice and started rewarding the clearest plan. Teams began to honor the person who caught the flaw rather than the person who hid it. Meetings ended with, "What did we miss?" not "Who gets the credit?" The air changed when honesty became a rule instead of a risk. The audience had watched a mask fall. They wanted fewer masks at work. Schools built from that momentum. Teachers put a sentence on the first page of their syllabi. Your value is not your score. Your value is your effort and your integrity. Students heard it and believed it when teachers lived it. A wrong answer became a chance to test a stronger method. A right answer became a chance to explain for a friend. Classrooms became less about rank and more about reach. That is what light does when it is not hoarded. At the center of all these moments sat a single chilly clarity. Intelligence stripped of humility becomes cruelty. Intelligence divorced from honesty becomes fraud. Intelligence used as spectacle becomes noise. None of those futures serve a nation or a neighbor. The audience did not need a philosopher to tell them. They watched it fail in real time and decided to do better. The decision felt like a door opening to air that was easier to breathe. So they distilled the night into a set of simple lines they could carry. Scores do not define intelligence. It was the first a shield against shame, a rebuke to arrogance, a reminder that tests cannot see the whole of a person. Humility and honesty are the real measure. It was the second a ruler that fits every hand from a janitor to a judge. True intelligence is not for boasting, it is for light. It was the third a mission for skill, a purpose for knowledge, a promise to share. Those three were the bones of the lesson. Everything else was flesh. Then came the closing sentence, the one that felt like a door locking behind a thief. The room heard it first, the country echoed it next, and finally even the loudest corners grew quiet for it. The mask of genius has fallen. What remains is character. It was not a punchline or a taunt. It was a judgment. It told the truth about a brand built on bluster and left no place to hide. It also told the truth about what the audience valued when the show was over. They repeated that sentence in many places, and each time it carried the same weight. A judge quoted it to a lecture hall and saw heads lift as if the room had grown windows. A union steward said it to a warehouse floor and watched a dispute cool into a plan. A grandmother murmured it at a kitchen sink and felt her shoulders drop as if a burden she never named had finally climbed down. The line worked because it did not belong to politics. It belonged to dignity. It set a bar that anyone could reach and no swagger could fake. Under that bar, people began to make small, brave promises. They promised to stop using numbers as weapons, They promised to admit when they were wrong without making the whole world pay for it. They promised to teach what they know without belittling who does not yet know it. They promised to praise effort out loud and keep pride on a short leash. These promises were not slogans. They were habits trying to be born. Habits once born are stronger than outrage. The audience also learned what not to fear. They learned not to fear a hard question if the truth is near. They learned not to fear a low mark if the path is long. They learned not to fear apology when the facts demand it. Fear untamed turns into cruelty. Fear confessed turns into courage. The lesson made room for that change, and people took it. In time, the crowd saw how the three lines braided together. If scores do not define intelligence, then no one gets to claim a crown by test alone. If humility and honesty are the real measure, then anyone can reach the standard by choice, not birth. If intelligence is for light, then the brightest among us are the ones who lift lamps, not the ones who polish mirrors. This braid was stronger than any one thread. It could pull a community forward without breaking. And so the audience who had come to be entertained by a fall left with something harder and better a way to stand. They stood for the kid who learns slow and sticks with it. They stood for the worker who asks for help before a mistake becomes a danger. They stood for the teacher who says, "Show me your steps," and means it. They stood for the neighbor who tells the truth even when it shrinks his pride. Standing like that is not flashy, it is steady. Steady wins longer than clever. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything, like subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.